Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 313, and welcome back to my co-host Jordan Tyra. How are we doing?
I'm good, thank you. Good to be back as always.
Thank you for coming back on, mate. We're joined today, very exciting episode, Hannah Sheridan. Hannah, how are we doing?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
I've been hounding you on LinkedIn to try and get you on, so I really appreciate you finally coming on the podcast. We've got some really good stuff to go through in this episode. Some stuff that I know Jordan will relate to as well. But yeah, keen to get into that in a second. But Hannah, just take us through your background a little bit to start us with.
Yeah, sure. So it's probably a bit of a different background to most, but at the moment I'm head of women's sports science at Spurs Women. I've been at the club for 7 years now, but initially went in 2017 as first team nutritionist with the side. A couple of years in that role, I moved into the lead nutritionist position, and we've kind of grown our team there at Spurs, with our women's team being in the WSL and not having had too much nutrition support in the past. I moved over on the same training ground site as the men's and the boys' academy, but moved over to the women's building and started working with them in March 2023. And then it wasn't the prettiest season for them at this point. They were in a relegation battle. And yeah, a lot of my work was just like starting to get the basics in place, but also really focus on that match day nutrition, I guess, because we needed some points at this point. And then last July, I moved into the role of head of women's sports science. It was actually called head of performance and female athlete health, bit of a mouthful. But we've just aligned everything across the club this season. So yeah, I've been managing our physical performance team, psychology and nutrition. So that's my kind of background at Spurs. And then prior to that, I worked across various different Olympic sports with junior and senior international athletes across hockey, athletics, swimming, archery, which was, I guess, great when I was first starting out as well, because I was learning how to adapt quickly to, giving nutrition advice to match the different physiological and nutritional demands of different sports, but also going into different environments and cultures. So the culture in football is very different to what you would find in rugby or individual sports like athletics. So it meant that I had to adapt my kind of my style as well to match those different environments. And I think that was a real big area of growth for me as well.
Wow, really cool. Really cool background. Was football always where you wanted to end up, or is that just how your career sort of progressed?
Yeah. Yeah, my background is actually athletics. So I loved working. I was actually at the High Performance Centre in Birmingham prior to Spurs, but I really wanted to be part of like a centralised environment where you were travelling and you could really get stuck in, because my role in Birmingham was, I'd go in and I'd come out. So I'd just be in and out. You weren't like fully immersed in the environment. And I guess football is probably one of the best places for that. And it's where there's a lot of job opportunity. And then I loved my time at Spurs, and kind of that's where I've stuck now. So yeah, I don't know if I had like guess it, like a lot of people, when you're starting out in elite sport in as like a practitioner, you kind of go where the job is at first, especially when you're young and just starting out. I didn't really have too much of a choice. Fell into the Olympic sport side of things, and then yeah, no, I've loved my time in football. So yeah, that's where I am.
Is that the same, you'd say, in terms of your career progress, in terms of your roles as well? Because obviously being nutritionist initially and now leading departments, like, was that sort of a natural progression, or again, was that something that you felt that was where you were working towards?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I haven't really, I've just kind of like moved through and figured out what I want to do as I go. Like I always had a passion to work in elite sport as an athlete myself previously. And then I decided nutrition was the area I wanted to work in. And then I've done like over 10 years of that now. And I got to the point when I was deciding that I needed to change from the men's game. It was like, definitely want to work with female athletes, but actually, how long am I going to love just being a nutritionist for? Because I love leading and I love management and making an impact beyond just the players. And then that's where I thought, like, I need to think about what's next for me as well. And it just happened. I had no idea when I went over to the women's side that there was going to be this restructure going on. And it just felt like, yeah, the natural progression, I guess. And it's quite different because a lot of the time in a kind of head of performance or head of sports science role, it's not always a nutritionist. But I actually don't think that should be the way, and it's worked for us at the moment. And yeah, my team is absolutely great, and I would never claim to be an expert in all those areas. Having a sports science background, I kind of understand, physical performance, psychology. Obviously, nutrition is my expertise. So that is important. But then I've got experts in that I trust and are like highly renowned in that space who do a great job for me. And that's what it's all about at the end of the day. So I have been like reaching out to a lot of practitioners, especially like Australia, America as well, that aren't necessarily strength and conditioning background, for example, which is your typical route as a head of sports science. I would say that tends to be their area of expertise. So it's just kind of like evolved over time, and as the years have gone on, I've just had plans in place for what I might think's next. But I guess like way back in 2013 and stuff, when I was doing my masters, I didn't think necessarily that would be what I would go into.
I mean, that'd be refreshing for a lot of like people earlier on in their career to hear that you didn't fully know like the route that you were going to go. You talked about the sort of the traditional way of who's ended up in these head of department roles, but do you think it's more important, not necessarily about the background and the roles that the person has had, more about maybe the personality type, the skill set? And you just mentioned there about having the ability to reach out and back individuals with different skill sets. Do you think it's different? It's not just the role determines who should be in that position?
Yeah, 100%. You see it a lot, not just in football, but I think, if someone's been at a club or with a team for 15 years and then the club looks at it and thinks, oh, right, they'd be the natural person to go into that role, but hasn't looked at their wider skill set. I think, was it Ollie Morgan who was on your podcast from Leicester? Yeah. A while ago. And I thought his the conversation you guys had was great. And he mentioned a similar thing. It's like you've really got to look for, as a manager, as a leader, what kind of skill set are you looking for? Not just, you don't want a jack of all trades necessarily. Definitely, you've got to have an understanding of the areas that you're managing, but then you want people better than you almost. And that's for sure what I've got in, especially in the psychology and physical performance space. We were talking about Laura Bowen earlier, but she's brilliant, leading our physical performance department at the moment. And we basically headhunted her because I was like, I know we need someone really strong in this space, and that's someone that I can trust, because like I said, I'm not there. I don't want to be periodized in the training week. That's not my thing. So yeah, I think it's important that you can recognize that yourself, and you can own up to the fact that, I don't, I'm not micromanaging. I don't want to be an expert in all those areas, but then it's bringing it all together and how we work collaboratively as an MDT. So no, I think that's completely it. You need to look for people with those skill sets as well to be a manager and a leader.
That transition that you've seen from your career, from being the sort of technician in terms of the nutritionist to now being in this leadership role, essentially, what are some of the key skills where you've got, actually, I didn't really need that so much in the previous role, but now this is something I've got to really focus on and develop to thrive in my role? Is there anything that sort of stands out for you in terms of attributes or skills that you felt like you needed to push on with?
Yeah, I think communication is absolutely massive. So I'm on the senior leadership team in our women's department. And so like any messages that other people that I manage, we might need to convey to the manager or to the operations team, like I am ultimately responsible for that. And anything we're doing as a department, we want to share that and make sure that's communicated openly and with transparency to other staff. So I think communication has been massive, but also with my own team. And really looking at like how you manage different individuals. Obviously, when I've been just kind of like lead nutritionist. I might have only managed a couple of staff, or I might not have had to worry about managing anyone. And, you know, I don't have to necessarily think about that. But now it's like, right, how do I effectively manage that person to do the best job they can do? And it's different across all the people that I manage at the moment. So that's definitely something as well. Being honest and open. You know, we did a really great session at the start, but just before our pre-season started, actually, but just the performance department, where we sat down and we went through our like values as a department, because obviously we might all have different values, but let's look at what is kind of similar across us all and create a set of values that we're going to stick to. And then every week we sit down and we actually look through them, and we're like, right, what have we done this week to make sure we've matched our values, or what have we not done and what can we do better? And we find that's really useful, because one of the big ones for us was balance. And it was about, you know, football and working in elite sport. You don't always get a lot of balance in terms of like work-life balance, but we'd all put that we've really valued like family and friends. So we've been trying to hold each other accountable for making sure we take like a bit of downtime here and then. So then when we're at work, we're refreshed and we're ready to go. And just little things like that make us work so much more cohesively and enable us to understand each other. And I guess that's a part of my role that I would have never done before, when I was kind of like a one-man band doing nutrition, basically.
You mentioned before we started recording about some of the differences from the previous staff that you've been with to now in terms of the size. And this is what we spoke about before on the podcast, is trying to find, I think we mentioned it in the Pompey episode, Jordan, didn't we, about finding a bit of a sweet spot between, you might want certain job roles filling, but at the same time, if you've got a nice balance with your staff, like you just mentioned there's good conversations going on, you can be quite honest with each other, you've got each other's backs. How many more people do you want to add into the equation that maybe going to make that a little bit more blurred? It's quite a hard thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's great when you're working with a team where, you know, you can have 6-7 physios, because players can get treatment whenever they want, and you've got staff around to deal with rehabs and all of this different stuff. But then equally there's the downside to it, where messages go missing, and if someone's not at a game and other practitioners are at the training ground, you've got to remember that everything needs to be communicated, because if someone misses something really small, I mean, it can mess a lot up and have a big impact. So I actually find at the moment we're in a really good place, where we haven't got a team as big as what, like on the men's side, that I was used to, for example. But it works perfectly. Yeah, okay, yes, it might be a little bit more work for some of us, because our player to staff ratio isn't as big. But in terms of how effective we can be, I think we are being as effective as possible. Like the amount we meet as a group and how we communicate is just a lot easier when you're in a slightly smaller group.
That was one thing we spoke about, Jordan, wasn't it? About especially the Pompey episode, but obviously you see it with the team that Hannah's with as well. There seems to be a bit of it's not the same for everyone, because we know that every position, every club is slightly different. But there does seem to be a bit of a sweet spot, doesn't there, in terms of the amount of staff?
Yeah, 100%. And I think Hannah's hit the nail on the head there in terms of, if you've got a slightly smaller squad size that you're working with, you know, having 10 plus staff and multiple physios and stuff, you run the risk of things getting missed, don't you, in terms of communication and stuff like that. Just a question for you on that, Hannah, in terms of, with the slightly smaller environment in comparison to working on the men's side, have you found there's more not so much collaboration, but is there more sort of desire to sort of stick to those values, put those values into place? Are you able to put them into place a bit better because the staff structure is slightly smaller?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say that's another thing that has helped us in terms of the values, especially, is we can meet more regularly. It's more realistic to get, you know, 6, 7, 8 of us in a room than it is to get 15, 20 of you in a room each week. So that definitely helps. And then also, it's not just us working as a performance department together, it's us working where there's only so many of them within those separate teams. So it's much more likely that we can have those in-depth conversations with them, because they're the ones leading on we've got 2 analysts at the moment, and they're leading on everything. And yeah, it's just, you find that time much easier than trying to get around like 5 different people within one department, or more than that. So yeah, I'd say it's that fine line between how many practitioners do you need to be like really, really comfortable, and how many do you need to be like do the most effective job you can. And it's probably not the same number.
Yeah, no, it's great.
It's funny though, you say about that there in terms of the bigger you go, the communication is always the anchor of it, isn't it? And that in the ideal world, people go, oh yeah, well, I've, like I said, 7 physios and this, that, the other, but there still needs to be somebody or multiple people who are sending out the consistent messages. The communication needs to be really aligned. And like you say, well, it's such a high-paced environment that one misstep and one message missed could mean a player's gone out and done a rehab that they shouldn't have done. They've joined in with training early, little things like that. So I think that communication element comes home really, really, really key there. And have you found the environment women's versus the men's game? Because there'll be a lot of people listening to this who are potentially earlier in their career, and with the explosion of the women's game only for the better, and more roles becoming available in the women's game now. Some of them might not have worked in the women's game yet, and may have done an internship, whatever, in men's game, and want to investigate going into the women's game. Have you found there's some key differences as a staff? Do you need to have different skill sets, or is it the same game? You can just step in, or what do you reckon?
Yeah, definitely differences. I would say, unfortunately, because the women's game hasn't been so heavily invested in previously, that there are some staff, especially like coaching staff, that they won't have been exposed to working with a psychologist before, or a nutritionist. So it's making sure we can educate the wider staffing group as well. But also going from the men's game to the women's game, the players, just males versus females, are very different, like emotionally. So we find that, I've always found working with female athletes, whether it's been football or not, that they need to know detail and they need justification of why they're doing everything, which as a practitioner is brilliant, because you're like, oh, this is what I love, this is my thing, I want to tell you all about like why you should be taking this or doing this. And for them to understand it is brilliant, because then you get better buy-in. They also go away from the club and they implement those habits because they understand why they've got to do it, rather than just being told and then they forget about it because actually they don't really understand the justification of it. So that's a massive difference, I'd say, for me, probably the biggest one, going from the men's to the women's game.
Brilliant.
And as a staffing group, you need to be a little bit more empathetic,
Yeah, which is important anyway, isn't it? But then, yeah, like you say, I think it becomes even more important around this developing a team. Like we spoke about, we've talked about the numbers of the team, which we obviously can be discussed. But for you mentioned about obviously people like Laura coming into the club. What are you noticing, apart from experience maybe and some of the things that people know that someone like Laura has done? What is it about her? What is it about some of the other people that you've brought in that maybe made them stand out?
Yeah, it definitely is partly experience. It's also the person for me. So is when we're interviewing is not necessarily looking at just what's on the CV and what's on the paper, but actually the person. Like, can we mold them into this environment? Do they have the ability to connect with players and other staff? So like a lot of our second round interviews will be much more relaxed and all about the person, and making sure that they meet a lot of the wider group as well, to see like how are they going to fit in with this group, because priding ourselves on our MDT approach and that sort of collaboration is massive for us. And if we don't have someone that's going to come in and fit into that and want to collaborate and build that trust with the players and the rest of the staff, then we're not really going to get anywhere, even if they've got the best knowledge in the world. And that was something like when I connected with Laura, like we spoke and we had so much in common and the feedback on her was great. I just got a really good feel for her. So yeah, I think that was a massive part of it, on top of the fact she was a real expert in the area she works in as well, and has got some great experience.
And what would you say maybe some of the big no-nos for you? Like, you must have had some people coming into interviews, and Jordan probably can give some examples of this as well, where CVs might look great, experience might look great, but then there's certain things which just like, that's not quite going to work.
Yeah, I think if people are almost like too big for their boots, a little bit arrogant, almost telling you how to do your job, or how, like, almost signing themselves up to the role already. I've got it because I'm amazing, and actually I think we could do this and this, but not in necessarily a humble way. Yeah, that's not what we look for. I think it's and also just as well, like, if you've got loads of football experience, that's not necessarily to us amazing. You could have all the football experience in the world, but what you're doing has not been that great. So actually looking outside the box and people that are going to bring something a little bit different, potentially from other sports and other environments, I think that's massive. And I do think that is a weakness of football sometimes, is that you're in football and you look for someone who's got a pure football background. And I don't always think that's the answer. Yes, I'd say, like, at the highest level, you need to understand how relentless it is and how fast paced it is and the sort of environment you're going into, because it's not for everyone. But equally, just having football experience and no other isn't always doesn't always mean you're the best candidate, I think.
Is that what you found, Jordan, as well, in terms of that sort of maybe arrogance, that, like, yeah, basically that, in terms of coming into that interview process?
Yeah, 100%. I think we're always able to learn, aren't we? As practitioners, we're always able to learn something. So if you're going in and basically trying to present yourself as a finished article, you're just going to be rubbing people up the wrong way. And even from interviews I've gone into before, and interviews that we've had to hold for people coming into clubs I've been at, going in almost admitting, yeah, I've got loads to learn on this, but I'm really hungry and want to learn on this. But I see my strengths here, but this is where I can improve, and that could be something to do. Almost admitting areas you can improve, in my opinion, actually is a strength. It is something which is valuable, because it shows the people that who are interviewing you are reflective. You know where your strengths and weaknesses might lie, and B, you've openly said, I'm willing to learn and want to put this into practice. So I think that's important. I don't come across like you finished article. And for any younger practitioners, maybe students listening, trying to go into it, like, just the biggest piece of advice is students who think they've cracked it and made it. And we've all been
Yeah.
at some point when you first graduate, you think you've made it, but you've not. Like, there's a long way to go in the process. So any students listening, just remember where you are a little bit.
Linking on from that is just around if you're asked what your kind of like weaknesses are or areas for improvement, it's actually having some. I find it really difficult to listen to people and they're like, oh, I'm not sure what my weaknesses are or what my work-ons are. And, like, as long as I've been in practice, there's always things I can work on and always things I want to do better. So if you just think you've got absolutely nothing to work on, then to me, I'm questioning that straight away.
Yeah, that's probably a little bit of a lack of awareness, isn't it? I mentioned when Jordan mentioned that, a bit of Dunning-Kruger kicking in, that people thinking they're the expert long before they are. I think we've all seen a bit of that before.
Yeah.
No, but really interesting just around. I think there's a lot of advice there for coaches going into any sort of interview process. Bear in mind some of the things that Hannah's mentioned, because I think they're really valuable. And also, it's your opportunity, isn't it, to show that you're going to fit within that team. So if you go in thinking you're the bee's knees from day one, like, you're probably going to rub a lot of people up the wrong way. You have to work with these people a lot. You have to go into these meetings that do your speaking around, sit around a table and have these conversations. It's not the best start, is it? Let's move on to, I know something that's massive in your role, and that's female athlete health. I think this is a really fascinating area, because obviously it's specific to the female game, but also we talk about having specialisms in terms of academy football, first team football. This is very much specialist in terms of working with females. So in terms of when we talk about female athlete health, do you want to give a little bit of background on maybe what you lead on, some of the things that you consider within your role and with the team?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously with my background in nutrition, some of the initial topics that kind of like fall under this umbrella would be RED, so relative energy deficiency in sport, which is then heavily linked with menstrual cycles and menstrual tracking. You then look talking about body composition, which of course isn't just in the female game, or it's not something you do just with female athletes. It's actually something that's probably a bit of a taboo in the women's game, but trying to like bridge the gap there and figure out ways that we can monitor it and use it effectively, but create a positive culture around it. It was something I was massive on trying to do when I first went over to the women's side. Then something we've brought in recently is like a pelvic health physio. So it's an area that people just don't think about. Female athletes probably are aware that they have pelvic floor muscles, but don't. It's amazing when you do like questionnaires with the players and with athletes, how many of them actually show signs of like a dysfunction, but they just think it's normal and kind of dismiss it. But actually the impact it can have on performance is quite big, and obviously it's not ideal to have issues with your pelvic floor when you're training and playing matches at the level they are. And then the kind of last topic that we've looked at as well in the last couple of years is just breast health and making sure like sports bras are fitting properly. Things like that, again, can have an impact on performance. So yeah, they're kind of the areas that we've covered at the moment. And of course, I'm not delivering on this all myself. I bring in experts as well in this field, but it's kind of my area to lead on and drive.
I think this is so good to see, because we spoke a lot about how much the female game has sort of progressed over the last few years, but these are areas now that probably, when you look at the game, like they should have been considered before, shouldn't they? But they're not. So it's great to see a club like yourselves really focusing in on them and getting so specific. And in a few years' time, you hope that all this stuff is going to be the norm, isn't it, within the game? And then that's going to allow for them to kick on again. The players are going to be able to progress again, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think this is just one of those big stepping stones in the women's game, and it just shows you kind of like where they were, but also how far we're moving now, which is brilliant.
In terms of your background with nutrition, it's something that actually a couple of episodes ago, as we record this, there's an episode out with Amy O'Keefe, and Amy spoke before about some of the challenges that she's faced with female players in terms of nutrition, getting them to eat the right things. But then there's obviously the whole issue around, or the challenge around, body composition as well with female players. And I do think this is probably creeping in with the men's, or well, not necessarily men's, but the boys, the academies a little bit more now as well. But how have you found that in terms of this challenge with body composition against performance and educating players the right way?
Yeah, a lot of clubs, the view from coaching staff and other practitioners in the team is like, don't go near body composition. We're going to cause eating disorders if we do this. But for me, I'm like, if you can be on one page as a staffing group, especially with the staff as well, and then you distill that down into the players and get them to understand like why we're doing it and how performance related and health related as well, we're going to focus this body composition sort of culture on, then I think you've got no issues. So for me, when I first went in at Spurs Women, they weren't doing any body composition assessments. A lot of players had never had them before. But then you're like, right, we're doing all this great education work around nutrition and they're performing better on the pitch. We've got no idea what their body composition is like. And we can't be, when it comes to the following season, we could actually give them a target of like, look, this is where you're performing at your best last year. When we were doing daily wellness, this is when you were reporting feeling your best. But if we're not collecting that data, then we're never going to be able to feed that back and we're never going to know. So kind of the first steps were around speaking with other practitioners and the coaches around how we can make this a really positive culture. And then it was actually myself and the physical performance coach at the time that delivered a series of workshops to the players before we started any of the assessments, basically to say, this is why it's important. This is what we're looking at. It's very focused on how you're feeling, your performance, and also your health and well-being as well. So we've collected data over time now for each individual player and matched that up with like physical testing data, performance on the pitch, feedback from the coaches and like what they're seeing. They're not getting any body composition data, but they're telling us like, oh, actually, I think this player needs to be stronger, faster, whatever. And our performance team will put a plan together, and that might mean building muscle mass. It might mean losing a bit of body fat. It might mean putting on muscle mass, but actually not bothered if the skin folds go up a little bit. So it's very much this individual approach, players understanding that we're not going to give them blanket targets and say, right, everyone has to have their skin folds below 80 mils or something. It's really individualized, focused on performance, focused on health and well-being as well. And that's kind of how we've gone about it. And we've got players that have had previous really bad experiences at other clubs where skin folds have not been used in that way and have been used to decide who's in the starting 11 that week. And, it's a real trigger for them. And we have to tread so carefully around how we approach those players. And they, for some players, we might have to refer them for support, external support outside of my realms as a nutritionist. So yeah, we just have to respect that. And I think that is something I am seeing more with female athletes. But ultimately, I think if you can create the right culture, using the data in the right way and you're individualizing it, then there shouldn't be any harm and it shouldn't be any negative effects from it.
Yeah, because I was going to say those three things or three incidences maybe that you brought up in terms of reducing body fat and adding muscle, but then adding muscle without worrying too much about skin folds. They're three, in terms of just society as a whole, when you speak to a lot of, I don't think even necessarily, Jordan, you might be able to give a little input on this as well. Not necessarily just girls, but also boys as well in that sort of environment. If you're speaking about those three things, they're quite big challenges, aren't they, to get across to young athletes?
Yeah.
I was going to say, Hannah, just a question.
Oh, absolutely.
No, for yourself there. How much have you found, because younger players now coming into the WSL, you're seeing quite a lot of teenagers breaking into the WSL, probably more teenagers. I'd need to do stats on this. Teenagers in the WSL versus teenagers in the Premier League in the men's game. How were you finding their experiences with that in terms of talking about body composition, just female health in general? Is it getting into the academy level yet? Because I mean, when I was in female game, which was talking 8 years ago now, I was just doing the maths in my head, that we weren't in a position to be able to have those conversations with the clubs I was at. So is it now getting into those academy systems?
Yeah, so now we have a nutritionist who works with our women's side, our first team side, sorry. She will go and do education workshops with the academy. But what we did find is that their knowledge was just nothing, basically. And like what they were eating, they were definitely under fueling and in low energy availability, but purely because of the lifestyles they're living in terms of like they're going to school miles away, they're then traveling in evenings to come to training. Food provision at school isn't amazing. And then when they come into the club, again, food provision isn't amazing because the investment in the girls' academy is just not there. So it's just been a massive, massive education piece. And, there's still way more to go on. But yeah, I'd be impressed if we found an academy that was doing much around body composition and it, like probably even nutrition. It's getting better, definitely. So yeah, at the moment, when players come up from our academy, it depends on the age as well. Like if they're over 18, then we'll offer them body composition assessments and they'll go through the whole education process that our women's first team have, and they're great with it. They're really open to it. So there's no issues there. It's just that their knowledge is basically nothing. So yeah, there's loads of work to be done there.
I think that is across academy football, boys and girls, though. And I've done it with boys academies, their knowledge, and like you say, actually just getting them to eat enough in a day with being at school, running around PE, getting home from school, getting to training, actually finding time in the day to get some fuel on board, we know is a real struggle. But like you said, I think that's really important for anyone listening. The education around it, like even if you can just get them 10, 15 minutes at the end of an analysis session or whatever, just before training, during the end of the warm-up, whatever it might be. Yeah, just getting that quick little snippets of information and keep banging that drum. It hopefully starts to get that out there, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It's finding those little windows. And like you said, even 15 minutes can have an impact. And at the moment, it just needs to be the basics, like how frequently they need to be eating, some examples of foods that are easy to eat on the go, and what to bring for after training for recovery so you're ready to go again the next day. Stuff like that will make a massive difference. And it's just starting that education process. And again, like you said, low energy availability, I would say, is one of the biggest issues in academies. And Marcus Hannon did some great research on boys academy players around that, but looking at the huge variation in energy expenditure of different players within the same age group, just due to the different rate at which they grow and mature, and then how little they're consuming compared to what they're expending. And we can't expect, put them on a DEXA, they're not going to be at the same level that a men's first team player is, or a girls academy player is not going to be the same as a women's first team player. But it doesn't mean they're fat or overweight. They're growing, and we've got to appreciate that. And actually, a lot of the time we need them to be eating more.
It's important, because I know this is why Jordan brought it up, with these teenagers coming into first team environments within the WSL. Their progression is essentially, you're getting put into this league now that's super high intensity, and it's improving. It's the terms of the speed and everything of the game. We've talked about that a hell of a lot on this podcast. It's only going one way, isn't it? So there now becomes an even bigger emphasis on what the girls are doing before they then end up in those first team environments, with nutrition, with physical performance, like all these things in terms of preparation, because they're not preparing for the WSL 5 years ago. They're preparing for it now, aren't they? And maybe 5 years' time, where the demands are so much higher.
Yeah, completely. And I'm sure if you get Laura on here, she'll talk a lot more about that. But when we were looking at it last year, like the differences between winning and losing a game are all around this like high speed running and the amount of sprint distance. Obviously the data is not freely shared in the WSL yet, but when you're looking at like international level, so like the FIFA reports and stuff out of the World Cup, that is the difference between those winning teams. So yeah, just like you said, it's the fueling is becoming, ever more important now.
And you think it's in terms of those wins that you're seeing with the players, it's the small, maybe habitual sort of things that you can drop in on a daily basis? Is that the sort of approach that you take?
Yeah, definitely. We did a lot last year. Was probably my first full season working with them, and we had some good scope. Like the coaching staff are brilliant at allowing us like a 20-minute, half an hour window every now and then to get a workshop in, and we try and keep it as interactive as possible. So yeah, we had some really good education sessions with the players, and then just being around day to day, having infographics up, but being around at meal times, helping them to understand how to build their play, making it interactive. Players that would like a more detailed kind of look for us to look in more detail at their food diaries and what they're doing away from the training ground, like making sure we spend the time with those players is really important. But I find that the women's side are brilliant at that. The players are great. They give you that time. They'll come and see you for 10 minutes in the morning for a one-to-one chat and a catch up around their own nutrition. So it's a bit of like, because we have the scope to do workshops, it's a bit of like doing that, but also then individualizing it as well when we can, and getting that like short windows of one-to-one time too.
Yeah, definitely important, that, isn't it? In terms of the future, you've talked around some of the focuses right now for female athlete health. Where do you see the areas that we really need to focus on, that need more development, maybe more research in the next sort of 2, 5, 10 years? Like, where are some things that you feel like, okay, we're not doing that now, but that definitely needs to come into play in the next few years?
I think if we can get more data on around menstrual tracking, and it's the $1 million question, like, do periods affect performance? There is some great data collection going on and some research going on, but to get it from like real world environments, like, you know, a football team would be great. And there's a lot of clubs that will probably say they're tracking, doing some menstrual tracking, but they're not necessarily like using it in the right way or tracking the right stuff. So part of that is educating staff on how to do that and how to do it well. But also we need to collect the data and find out, like, are periods affecting performance? Because there's, you know, you'll see headlines in the paper about it, but actually like the research isn't saying that yet. We don't have enough evidence, and what we are seeing, it's really individual. So a bit like skin folds, everyone will have their like individual sweet spot at which they perform their best and which they're healthiest and everything's going well. It's the same with what we're seeing from our menstrual tracking, is that, you know, some individuals will suffer really severe symptoms the week before or during their period, and then other players will have no symptoms whatsoever throughout their whole cycle. So there's no point putting the same intervention into place for one player as there is for another. So yeah, I think the menstrual cycle, how that impacts performance, all of that is a big one as well. And then I think with Reds, again, is more around the education. It's not necessarily, I mean, you could do research on how many players actually know what Reds is, but I think it's quite clear that when I went in to Spurs Women, I think we had one player that had heard of it. So then it's like, okay, if they don't know what it is, then they have no idea what signs and symptoms to look for. And you find that actually quite a few of them are inadvertently underfueling. But it's only because they haven't had the nutrition education and actually don't understand what their plate should look like at meal times and throughout the day, and how regularly they need to be eating to match the energy demands of the training and, you know, the match involvement that they're doing. So it's that education as well.
I always seem to ask a similar question with anyone around nutrition comes on the podcast, but how much does social media impact the players that you work on in terms of like what they believe is their education and knowledge around nutrition? Does that seem to be quite a challenge for you to maybe correct some myths that are out there, or do you feel like they lean more towards what you're putting across, and yeah, it sort of counterbalances it out?
Yeah, I remember when the that documentary came out on Netflix about veganism and,
Oh
you know,
yeah.
how bad dairy and meat and everything is for you. And there was a big around that time, not like on the men's side and the women's side, there was a big kind of shift in mentality, and players thinking they need to cut this and that out. And that was a challenging time, I'd say. But the good thing was is we had a few players like try it here and there and notice that they felt like terrible or they can't recover properly. And how difficult it is to replace those nutrients in your diet with like plant forms, for example. Like, we were supporting their views, but equally trying to educate them that it might not be the best route for them. So that was a bit of a nightmare time. But I'd say, yeah, I think if you don't provide the nutrition education, then, you know, players and athletes will go elsewhere, look for it, and that's when they go to social media, and that's when, yeah, we have some players come to us for some weird and wonderful things, but they're pretty good at respecting the experts, I'd say. We've had, I'd say, a big one in the women's game is around nutrition for like supporting your menstrual cycle. So, oh, do I need to eat more of this during this phase and less of this during this phase? And really, there's just not enough evidence for us to be saying that yet.
Mm.
So, you know, during your period, it probably is a bit of an inflammatory process. But if you're an elite athlete, anti-inflammatory foods are going to be useful and helpful and important at all times. It doesn't really matter. So yeah, we try and avoid, and we try and educate the players that actually we can't be giving them that sort of information at the moment. But what we do look at is, through our tracking system, is we look at symptoms and we don't just track look throughout the whole phase. So every day we're asking the same questions around positive and negative symptoms they might be experiencing, so we can start to build a picture for each individual and figure out if actually consistently they've got increased appetite a couple of days before their period, and or consistently they've got back pain during the period. If these things are consistent, then we can start to think, okay, right, this is real player this month or month. Let's put a bit of an intervention into place to support them and make sure it doesn't impact their training and performance. But then other players won't experience any of those symptoms. So there's no point in us standing in front of the whole team and saying, right, when you're on this phase in your period, you need to be doing X, Y, Z, because it's you know, it wouldn't be accurate. So yeah, I think that's where we're at the moment. It's just building these individual pictures. Tracking as a starting point is so important, so you can understand what is the norm for each player. Like, you know, their cycle length will be different, the symptoms will be different. You know, some of them might be using hormonal contraceptives, some of them might not. You've got to think about that as well. So yeah, it's just like a real individual approach. It's a bit of a minefield, to be honest, but there's some good work that can be done.
There is, and also it sounds like there's a good question being asked as well by the players, isn't there? Because that's not a question where you're like, actually, that's been guided by some bullshit on social media. That's actually a legit question. We've not quite got the full answer to it yet, but it sounds like there's some good questions being asked, which is always a positive, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the one thing you will get with females, I think, is a lot of questions. But we're here for it.
Awesome. And that's been really, really good. I think, yeah, we've gone into some really cool information there. And there's obviously, in terms of the women's game, we talk about the progress all the time, but it's great to see the sort of next level that is being taken, the next approach being taken for making things even more specific and kicking the game on again, which is great to see. If people have got any questions for you, is there anywhere you'd recommend them to go to reach out to just follow what you're doing?
Yeah, I would say my LinkedIn profile, also my Twitter account. I say Twitter, it's now X, isn't it? Yeah, which is HS Performance Nutrition. So yeah, you can find me on there.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for coming on and giving up your time. Really, really appreciate it. It's great to have you on.
Thanks very much for your time, guys. It's brilliant. Speak to you soon.
Jordan, I thought that was a really good episode because obviously from your experience in the female game, just looking at the progression, how far things have kicked on and some of the aspects that Hannah and the team at Spurs are looking at. It's great to see that progress, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And the things she's talking about, dare I say, weren't being as spoken about, or they were, but they weren't being as implemented as much and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, it's been eight years, I think 7 years, depending on which club I was at. But I think the progress has been monumental, to be fair. And that's filtering right down through the academy, like Hannah was saying, in terms of the academy setups now for the women's game, starting to get these workshops in. And don't get me wrong, there's still so much more that needs to be done. But I think the investment's getting there. You know, there's now roles that are properly, you know, full-time roles in the academy setups and all this sort of stuff, which are going on now with the women's game, which is awesome, which weren't there before. So the more investment in those, the better the education is from an earlier age. The better the education is from an early age, the more educated they're going to be by the time they're going into first team demands. And obviously we didn't even touch on the bigger question at the minute with high ACL risk in WSL players and all this sort of stuff. Now, a lot of us are debating about training age and just the overall training age of, you know, women's players when they're younger. But if we start the conversation when they are younger about, you know, energy availability, fueling properly, training properly, you develop more strength, you develop your better training age, you know, it just snowballs. And it means that when you get to WSL ages or you break through into first team football, playing in those higher demand leagues, you know, with higher demanding structures in terms of games coming thick and faster than in the younger age groups, they're better prepared for it. So it's just like, you can see it starting to happen. I think that's what's really exciting.
I think it's also great to see and hear from, we got some great feedback on the Pompey episode on how cohesive the team looked, and we spoke about building this team, and it seems exactly the same with the team that Hannah's got there in terms of how well they're working together. And hopefully we'll get a little insight into that a little bit more as well, just to drop a little bit of a teaser. But I think that's great to see as well, isn't it? Because we're highlighting the things that we've got to get these players ready for. And yes, there's more teenagers getting into the first team environment. The demands are going up all the time. But now we've got teams that are supporting these athletes and players that seem to be, they're a lot more established, aren't they? With the likes of Laura Bowen coming into that team, there's a lot of experience now. So it's great to see that side of it as well in terms of the staffing structures.
Yeah, 100%. Again, I'll go back to when I was in the game, but it wasn't as, I definitely didn't work in an environment where you had head of performance with the sports science or physical performance coach and the nutritionist and other roles and analysts as well. It was a much smaller team, so it does show that the investment is occurring, is happening. But I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of what she was talking about in going too far with it, and like we were speaking with the Pompey lads about going too big with the team and having too many people in the room, and all of a sudden communication getting lost and messages are getting lost. Having a really tight, cohesive unit and the importance of that as a performance department only benefits the players. There's like literally very minimal downsides of having a very cohesive unit. So yeah, the really good episode, I think.
Yeah, no, big thank you to Hannah for coming on. No, it was great. I really enjoyed it. I think the more episodes we can get like that, the better. Focusing on real specific players and athletes. So yeah, really enjoyed it. And there's loads more to focus on in terms of around female athlete health as well, which is something we'll definitely cover in future episodes to come over the next few weeks and months too. So yeah, Jordan, thank you very much again for freeing up your time. Just final thing from me, check out the sponsors, Rezel, Good Prep, and Hydro as well. Make sure you go and give them a follow over on socials. And yeah, thank you again for listening.